All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Nic Podoll. I'm one of the organic consultants with the Rodale Institute in the Midwest. I'm located in Minnesota. And today I'm going to be talking to you guys about diversifying your organic grain rotation. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping things. First of all, that this webinar is going to be recorded and then it will be available later on Rodale's website in the webinar section underneath the archived webinars underneath the education section of the website. Put your questions as you have them during the presentation in the Q&A. There's a function there at the bottom. Don't use the chat, use the Q&A for that. I will get to all the questions after the presentation. So after I've gone through all my slides, then I'll start answering some questions. If you can't hear the audio or there's anything going on with that, you can call for assistance at 610-683-1481. And there'll be someone at Rodale there that will help you out with any audio issues you're having, help you out, have the experience, a good experience on the webinar here. Other than that, I'll get started. So. All right, well, talking about grain rotations or any organic rotation, these are kind of some goals that you should have for your rotation. So you want to accomplish some biological diversity in your rotation and be practicing long-term soil building. And this will help you protect your soil from erosion and nutrient losses. There'll be some opportunities to reduce tillage in your rotation, hopefully. You want to work to fit that in, and we'll talk about that later. And then also should have a goal of building inherent fertility and developing efficient nutrient cycling. And those things, we'll talk more about those in depth as we go here. But another goal you should have is breaking weed, pest, and disease cycles for better cultural control. Those things are important in a rotation, and diversity really helps to accomplish those things. If you're raising the same crops in the same season all the time, you can have issues with those things. And so diversity helps to reduce those issues in an organic rotation. The other thing that a diverse rotation does is to be able to spread risk and diversify your income. We'll talk a little bit more in depth again about that. Also, equipment and labor usage. A goal of yours in your rotation is to be able to spread that around so you can use the equipment and the labor that you have available more efficiently, spread that out so that you're not trying to fit everything you're doing into really tight windows, and you want to avoid the feast or famine type work schedule. And then profitability, of course, that's always a goal for every farmer, so you can keep going, right? But the ways that you do that in a diverse organic rotation are by reducing inputs over time. And what I say is you really want to focus on minimizing minimums instead of maximizing maximums. So it's kind of a little bit of a confusing statement in a way, but you think about that, break that down a little. You really want to minimize the problems that you're going to have so that you can really create sort of a baseline that you can always count on, that you're never going to drop below a certain level of production in your system. You want to focus on doing that instead of always trying to shoot for the moon. And we'll get into that a little bit more too. So some factors to consider when you're building a rotation. First are some agronomic factors and related to the entire system that you're building. So first thing to consider is fertility. you have to be able to understand the nutrient removal that's happening in your system after each crop, and then the credit that a crop might give, especially if it's a cover crop, and then availability of those nutrients as well, and the way that those nutrients are cycling through your system. So you have to consider those things from the previous crop, and then also for the following crop. So you're kind of looking at sort of 3 years at a time. Also with fertility, obviously in organic system, we rely a lot on animal manure. So looking at in your rotation, when that animal manure or possibly other mineral inputs that you might need, when do you need to apply those, at what points in the rotation? And then always asking yourself the question, does this rotation that I'm building build inherent fertility in my soil over time? Again, that's a big goal that you should have. And so in terms of fertility, you always want to be asking yourself that question and trying to work towards that goal. Weed control, what specific weeds will I need to control on my farm? Every farm has a different population of weeds depending on its cropping history and its region that it's in, its climate, all those things, soil types, etc. So you should know the life cycles of the weeds that are present on your farm. Know those life cycles and their likes and dislikes as intimately as you know your crops. And that will help you immensely to be able to control them. And so again, asking yourself the question with each crop in your rotation, is this going to contribute to my cultural control of weeds in my system, such as a solid seeded crop or a cover crop, or is it going to contribute to weed problems or be a crop that requires consistent weeding or cultivation, more like a row crop like corn or soybeans? And then being able to balance that out. And the bigger question, does this rotation suppress and reduce weed seed banks over time, over the course of the rotation and over time in your career as a farmer? Are you accomplishing that? More things, more system-wide things to consider, transference of disease and pests. We talked about that as a goal as well. And not only does weed control, but also breaking disease and pest cycles. But so sequencing crops properly so that you're not transferring disease or pests from one crop to the next. And again, asking yourself that question when you're looking at your rotation, does this rotation break disease and pest cycles? Or am I causing some problems with the sequence of crops that I have? And then how do I need to tweak that? Moisture is important. Know how much moisture your crops are going to need. Try to conserve that in your rotation where it's necessary or appropriate. Knowing, especially with cover cropping, knowing how they use moisture and affect the availability for next year's crop is important to understand as well. Tillage, considering when tillage is necessary. Understanding, that tillage breaks down your soil tilth, and if you're not doing it you want to be doing tillage with a purpose, no recreational tillage, right? You want to be, I think, general rule of thumb is that if you're going to be doing tillage, you should be incorporating at least some crop residue or a cover crop / green manure. So looking at the previous crop and the residue that's present, how you need to manage that residue with the tillage that you're doing, and then looking at over the course of your entire rotation, asking yourself that question again, does this rotation help me reduce tillage? Or am I doing more tillage because of the way I have my crop sequence? All right, other agronomic factors to consider, and these are more crop specific. So, and maybe even down to you know, the specific um, varieties that you're working with. So climate and growing season, obviously you want to be growing something that's going to grow well in your climate, but consider the growing season. Different crops also have different maturity groups. And so understanding how all those work and when you're going to have your planting and harvest dates. So again, looking at species and variety or maturity group, knowing the days to maturity, understanding also in an organic system your risk of contamination possibly from genetically modified crops through cross-pollination and planning accordingly for that. So, and then looking at vigor of whatever variety you're working with, the stand, its canopy, and its competition with weeds. That might be variety, but also different species compete in different ways with weeds too, right? So looking at all of that and thinking about, does early or delayed planting give me any advantage? So like a crop like oats, the earlier you can get it in is always better. But sometimes with corn or with beans, delayed planting can give us an advantage in an organic system. Especially thinking with corn and cross-pollination, if you need to keep that out of your system, especially with you know, food grade crops, or if you're going to be raising anything for seed or things like that. So then looking at specific species and varietal traits, the disease and pest resistance, there's factors there. Different varieties have different resistances to diseases. So take the example of oats or wheat again, but resistance to crown rust and things like that are important in an organic system where you can't use sprays to treat those things. Again, vigor, how quick is that crop going to get out of ground? Really important in an organic system to have good vigor, especially early on, so that it can get ahead of those weeds and shade them out. And then the physiological traits that you need to consider, like the height, the stalk strength, and how those factors are going to affect the kind of stand that you're going to have, how much you're going to be able to harvest. If you have a lot of lodging going on in a grain crop or something like that, that's might be something that's always really always something that you want to be looking at, and plant varieties that stand up well and give you the best opportunity to compete with weeds and have a good harvest. So, all right, economic factors to consider. Obviously, the cost of seed and inputs, and the field operations for each crop is important. And then your potential return on your investment based on realistic yield and price projections. Those things are things that farmers are always thinking about. I don't really need to point those out too much, but these last two that I have on the list are really important and something that I don't think gets thought about quite often enough. But so the value of what I like to call unrealized gains from soil building, from the weed control that you're accomplishing in your system through good cultural controls, and possibly nutrient credits from previous crops, like maybe soybeans, that's a fairly common one, but also from your cover cropping, more specifically, in a diverse rotation. And then also the cost of what I would call unrealized losses due to the loss of soil tilth or nutrient removal from a nutrient intensive crop like corn or something like that. You have to consider that in your system. And we'll get into that a little bit when we talk about soil building principles here too. Other things to consider, logistics and infrastructure. If you're diversifying your rotation and going to be growing some different crops, You need to make sure that you have the necessary equipment to plant and harvest those crops, but also to store them. Storage is really important because in a diverse rotation, because some of these crops that you might be considering growing in a system like this are going to not necessarily be the easiest to market right away. You're going to have to do some marketing work with some of these crops. And so you need to be able to have the ability to store them. Obviously, you like to have stuff marketed before you're going to put it in the ground. I mean, that's always what we say as a principle, but even so, there's probably going to be a period of time where you're going to have to store it after harvest before it's able to be picked up and shipped off to whoever the buyer is with some of these specialty small grains and that you might be growing in a diverse rotation. And so having good grain bin storage there is pretty key. And you can see there on the right is a picture of my family's farmstead, which is an organic farm. And we grow a lot of specialty small grains, and you can see all the bins we have there at the bin site to be able to store. And that's an older picture. We have even more bins than that now to be able to store the different quantities of specialty small grains that we're growing. So also looking at the number of acres and the labor required, the labor, considering the labor efficiencies. So I was talking about spreading that labor out and not feast or famine type work. But if you're doing a diverse amount of crops, you also have to make sure that you're not spreading yourself too thin in a way as well. So always want to make sure that you can accomplish the necessary tasks for each crop with the people you have available to do the work over the number of acres that you plan to plant some of these crops, and within the allotted time windows, and along with the other crops in the rotation. So got to make sure that you can do the work. If you're going to put the crop in the ground, you got to make sure that you can get the work in with all the other crops you're doing and get the crop harvested. Okay, now talking about soil building principles. This is a goal in a diverse rotation. This is a goal you should have, is to build your soil over time. And so these are some of the principles that I like to talk about, that in order to accomplish soil building, you need to be doing these things. Okay, so a green manure of substantial biomass should be incorporated into the soil, usually at least every third year. And so in your rotation, this can be from a cover crop, or it can be from just a pure soil building year, maybe at the head of your rotation, that you grow a thick cover over the summer, maybe graze it down or something like that. But then it's basically a skip year for cash cropping, but allows you to accomplish some weed control and get into some stuff with fertility too. And I'll cover some of that there as well. But weed control and fertility, that can accomplish those two things in your system. And so being able to do that, and then reducing tillage, incorporate a period of at least 1 year or more without tillage in your rotation. That's a principle that I like to abide by. So again, this can be a soil building year with a thick cover, maybe at the head of your rotation, or you can try to fit in periods in your rotation where maybe you're able to no-till another crop in after a previous one, and so you're able to get a little over a year without any tillage on your ground. And I'll give an example of that later too. But and then asking yourself this question always again: will the crops in the rotation and how I'm managing them and sequencing them add to my soil tilth, or is it taking away from my ability to build soil over time? And how can I manage that differently so that I'm building my soil instead of taking away from it? And so this next list is something to consider, where you have the choice of crops, and I've ranked them in terms of their ability to build soil. So number one, top of the list, are perennial grasses, like in a prairie, and that's, that's top of the list. That's usually not what you're going to have in in a grain cropping system, right? That would be more of a pasture situation, where you have perennial grasses that are being grazed. But in a grain system, you can have some of the top soil building, and that's the next thing there, the deep-rooted legumes like sweet clover and alfalfa. And those can be incorporated in your system. And I'll show some rotations with those later, but those are number one crops that would be, in terms of soil building, those would be top of the list. Second thing are annual grasses, your small grains, and then other shallow rooted legumes like clover as a cover crop, or peas as a grain crop. These things are second on the list in terms of soil building, and they also help you to accomplish some goals with fertility and weed control. And same with the deep-rooted legumes that are number one on the list. Next, I have solid-seeded broadleafs like buckwheat or flax. And again, these are crops that start to break down a little quicker, but they can help you accomplish some goals. Buckwheat is really great at outcompeting weeds and cleaning up a piece of ground. And it breaks down fairly quickly. So in terms of soil building, not real high on the list, but still valuable in a system. And then the last one is where we get to our row crops: corn, soybeans, dry beans, and vegetable crops like potatoes and onions. Those crops that are in rows that require most of the time a lot of tillage and cultivation, those over the course of the season are destructive of soil tilth. And so you have to understand in your system that when you're growing those crops, you're withdrawing from your bank of soil health. Okay. And you have to be able to pay those things back. And in order to build soil over time, you have to pay that back with interest, right? And so the other part of your rotation has to be building on top of what you've taken away in a year of row crop like corn or soybeans. And so that's what we're talking about here when we're diversifying a grain rotation, to be able to build soil over time, so that we can grow corn and soybeans, because those are our more profitable crops, right? So, I mean, we're going to want to grow those, but we have to be able to grow them in a system that's sustainable and that is good for soil health. And that's what this is about. So I want to focus here on one of those principles again, the substantial biomass, or green manure, that's grown every third year, allowing it to grow into maturity, so that you have lignified plant material. This isn't something that you hear a lot about, but it's extremely important. The role of lignin in soil. Lignified plant materials build a stable soil humus. And again, this is, I was talking about how, some of the broadleafs like buckwheat, they have a low carbon to nitrogen ratio. They break down very quickly, and how that's not necessarily a great soil builder. The reason for that is because they're not carrying a lot of carbon and cycling a lot of carbon through the soil. And so lignified plant material that breaks down slower is necessary to be able to build that carbon cycling, which affects all of your nutrient cycling. So what happens with lignified plant material when it's breaking down in the soil? I gave the example of sweet clover. There's a picture of that there on the left. Sweet clover has a 24-to-1 carbon to nitrogen ratio. It's the exact carbon to nitrogen ratio that soil microbes like for their diet. Their ideal diet is 24-to-1 carbon to nitrogen ratio. Lignified mature sweet clover is that plant material is that exact ratio. And so it's able to be broken down by those soil microbes, but it breaks down slower because it's a lignified material, because it's a mature material. And it also fixes a ton of nitrogen, which helps you in your production in your system as well, because it's a legume. But sweet clover is really a super soil builder because of those factors. It also provides a lot of fertility and weed control in your system. I'll talk about this in rotation too, but there are years that I've had my family's grown sweet clover as a soil in a soil building year, and there are years where we've grown, 15,000 pounds of biomass on top of the soil, and sweet clover is 7-8 feet tall. That takes out Canada thistle or any other weed that wants to grow underneath there pretty quickly. And it cleans your ground up really well. And makes it incredibly fertile as well. So it's a slow and sustainable nitrogen release from that plant material, combined with a carbon sequestration function, and really builds material or really builds soil over time, this lignified plant material. And so that's, if I could, take one of those soil building principles and say, really do this, that's one thing that I would say. So it's really important. Okay, now getting into some of the crop rotations here. This is a crop rotation that my family currently uses, and it's not a perfect rotation, and I'll tell you why. But so we apply turkey manure at the top of the rotation, and then we have a soil building here with sorghum, Sudan grass, cowpea, and forage soybean planted together. It shades out all the weeds, takes up that turkey manure as the fertility that was applied, and the forage soybean fixes a little nitrogen too in there, but then that crop is incorporated back into the soil, and then we go to proso millet. After proso millet, we no-till triticale and hairy vetch into that in the fall. And so that's that in that rotation. The proso millet to the no-till triticale and hairy vetch, that's the, if you think about the time from the planting of the millet in June to the time that you would harvest the triticale and hairy vetch the next year, and then you have a triticale and hairy vetch volunteer cover crop right after that. That's well over a year where you don't have any tillage in that system. And so that's accomplishing that goal. And then after the triticale and hairy vetch, next year is planted buckwheat, and then it goes back again. And you'll notice that there's no corn and soybean in that rotation. And I'm sure that most farmers out there are going to want to grow some corn and soybeans. And so I'll get to how to incorporate that into this as we go here. So the reason why this rotation is not perfect, though, is because as a principle on a rotation, I like to have, or you should have this in an organic system, a variety of different crop types that are grown in different seasons. So you have your cool season spring planted crops like oats or barley or spring wheat. You have your summer annuals here like millet or buckwheat, but also like corn and soybeans. And then you have your fall or winter annuals, and that's like rye or triticale and hairy vetch in this case. But you can see in here, you have you have essentially from the buckwheat at the end of the rotation, and then the sorghum Sudan grass, which is also planted in June, and then the proso millet, which is also planted in June. You have 3 crops in a row in that rotation that are planted in the summer, but in the later summer, really warm season stuff. And so what happens in this rotation, or what we're seeing happen, is over time, we see the cool season weeds like pennycress start to creep into our system. We're not controlling those very well, pennycress and shepherd's purse. Now, if the reason why we have had this rotation is because of weather issues, not being able to get into the fields in the spring like we would like to. And we've had a lot of wet cycles in our area that we've gone through over the last couple decades. And so we were sort of forced into this rotation. And it's kind of a pick your poison situation. If you're going to deal with any weeds, some of those cool season weeds are, if you have to deal with them, those are probably the least problematic. Okay, this is another rotation that I see in organic systems, and it has worked for some very experienced organic farmers for a long time, where they have alfalfa that is seeded with a nurse or companion crop of oats. And the oats are harvested off, and then they harvest another couple years of alfalfa, maybe 3 if they want to let it go that long. And then soybean, corn, soybean. Now, why not corn right after the alfalfa? You might be thinking that in an organic system, this particular farmer that I've got this rotation from, he figured out that in the system, planting corn after the alfalfa provided a great benefit for the corn, but he wasn't getting as good a weed control as he should be getting in his soybeans by going to corn first. And so if he goes to soybean first, he can harvest a better soybean crop, and then still get a good corn crop the next year. And then he goes one more year of soybeans before he goes back into alfalfa. And that last year in this rotation is going to be the weediest year, the more problematic year. But this is a successful rotation that's been working for an experienced organic farmer that I know for several decades. So this is a good rotation that can be done. Is it that diverse? Sort of, not necessarily. If you want to be more diverse than this, I can get into sort of combining some of the rotations that we've looked at here. But before we do that, I want to get into another rotation. And this is the rotation that my family used on the farm classically, that we haven't been able to do lately. But this is a very elegant rotation. That's how I would describe it. It works extremely well in an organic system. And so you have that lignified sweet clover that I was talking about in this rotation. And it goes to rye, buckwheat, undersown with sweet clover again, another year of sweet clover in the middle of the rotation, then to oats, barley, or spring wheat, and then turkey manure is applied in that last year, millet undersown with sweet clover, back around again. Extremely good rotation for weed control and fertility. But again, no corn and soybeans here. And so we want to I want to take the principles of this rotation and then try to fit corn and soybeans into it. So to do that, you want to think about what type of crops are each of those in that previous rotation, and look at that and what type of crops are corn and soybeans and where can we fit them in. So again, you have the soil building here at the head of a rotation. And so thinking about this in a corn or soybean system, this could either be sweet clover or it could be alfalfa. Then you have a fall or winter annual, rye, or possibly winter wheat, depending on where you're at. And then the next one in the rotation was a summer warm season annual. In the previous slide in that rotation, this was buckwheat. But if you think about what you could, if you didn't want to grow buckwheat, you wanted to grow corn or soybeans instead, this is where you could stick in soybeans, especially after rye. And you could possibly roll or crimp the rye, plant the soybeans. This could be possibly part of your rotation where you're getting that year or more in without tillage, again, accomplishing that goal. So in that third slot where that summer annual crop is, that's where you can fit soybeans in there. Then you could go back to another soil building here. Again, like I said, every 3 years, this is really ideal to build soil. And so going to sweet clover, or from that other rotation, the sorghum, Sudan grass, cowpea, forage, soybean, you could go to that. And with the sorghum, Sudan grass, you have the option to graze that now. And if you have animals, so you're thinking about incorporating some animals into your rotation as well, and that's an even loftier goal, which would be great. And so in the middle of the rotation, there again, having that soil building here, then you're going to a spring cool season annual. So this would be your oats, your barley, your spring wheat in there. And then you have a manure application, and then you can have, again, a summer warm season annual. And I think that would be where you would put in corn, right behind that manure application. And then you go back around to a soil building year. And so, again, you're not growing a lot of corn and soybeans here. You're growing some other, several other crops as well. But this is sort of a blueprint for building the principles for building a diverse rotation around corn and soybeans, and you can fit other crops in there as well, depending on what type of crops they are. And so I think about this in terms of, I'm going to use an analogy like a football game. If you're the farmer, you're the quarterback, if you're dropping back to pass it deep every time, right, the defense is just going to sit back and wait for that ball to come, right? And that's like what growing corn and soybeans over and over again is. Those deep passes, they might be home run years for you, but if you're doing that over and over again, the weeds are going to adapt and you're going to have more and more trouble. The small grains, the diversity in your rotation, again, like a football game, that's your running game. You're maybe not going to gain a lot of yards, all at once. You're maybe not going to gain a lot of profit, but you're going to gain something. But what is it doing? Is it's setting you up to be successful in the corn and soybean years, and in the football analogy, like your passing game. So when you do drop back to pass and go for a long game, you're going to be wide open. You're going to be successful in that. And that's what, again, in this analogy, that's the small grains setting you up for success in your corn and soybean crops. And that's what really we're looking for. And also accomplishing the soil building. So even in those years where you're taking away from your soil health bank with tillage and cultivated soybeans and corn, in the rest of the rotation, you're really building the soil again. That's about it that I got. I'm going to go to some questions soon here. Reach out if I don't get to all the questions today. Reach out to the organic consulting at Rodale. We'll put you in touch with a consultant that's the closest by to you, and you'll be able to get some help from us. If you live in Pennsylvania, there's free consulting that's available through a program with Pennsylvania Department of Ag. And so we're able to provide that to you for free. Other places, maybe some, but it's kind of a case-by-case basis outside of Pennsylvania as far as the free consulting goes, but it's a possibility. So yeah, if you have questions about trying to build your rotation, everybody's in a different spot in their rotation. And so looking at where you are in some of the rotation that I put out there, if you're trying to build a rotation like that, depending on where you are as far as the crops that you previously grew, the weed pressure that you're having, things like that, we can help you figure out where you're at and where you need to plug in to start in a rotation like this. Check out Rodale's website. There's a field day this summer, July 22nd at the campus in Kutztown. There's also our virtual campus on the website, the education, where there are courses that are available for you to take there to learn more about organic systems and regulations. There's lots of workshops and webinars that are available for free on the website as well. If you go into that archived webinars where this will be recorded and available later, there's lots of free webinars that are recorded there that are available as well. And with that, I will start to get to some questions here. So let's see, first question. Oh, will the slide deck be available? Yes, I covered that. I don't know if, I'm not sure if the slide deck is there, but if you really wanted something like that, you could get a hold of consulting and I could probably send that to you. Let's see, what else do I have for questions? Thoughts on alfalfa monoculture in rotation and impact on soil aggregation and structure due to low carbon nitrogen, resulting in microbes consuming soil carbon to balance the carbon nitrogen soil ecosystem. Okay. So just kind of considering that, alfalfa has, I think has a mature alfalfa stand. It's like a 25-to-1 carbon and nitrogen ratio. So fairly ideal for the most part there. But you can run into, some issues with not having a balanced system. I'm not quite sure exactly how to answer that question as far as the alfalfa monoculture. Just thinking about how to answer that one. If you're not growing it with like a companion crop or anything like that, eventually, even if you grow it with a nurse crop, eventually it's going to be a monoculture for at least a few years. Or you could be growing it with some grass, and that's fine. But generally, we can see, taking quite a bit of nutrients away from the system in terms of like phosphorus and things like that. But as far as the carbon to nitrogen ratio, in my experience at alfalfa, mature alfalfa stand that's incorporated, is fairly ideal in terms of that. When you incorporate it though, before you go into corn or soybeans after it, you want to not necessarily take a full cutting and just incorporate the little bits that's left after a cutting of hay. You want to actually incorporate a stand at the end, I think, when you're terminating that alfalfa. I think that's more the ideal situation there, and I think that's maybe where you would probably run into some trouble versus having success. I think if you incorporate an actual stand of alfalfa rather than just the short mow down after you harvested the last bit of hay that you can off of it, you might have to sacrifice the hay cutting there to be more successful with that, I think. Source of organic turkey manure in Nebraska. Off the top of my head, I'm not sure as far as turkey manure specifically, but I'm sure that I could ask around and find out if there is. There may be some smaller operations that are out there that there might be some turkey manure available. But again, I don't know right off the top of my head. All right, another question. Where in the last rotation was the no-till years? So in that last, either looking at the one with the small grains, you have the years where there's the sweet clover, and they were undersown in the crop previously, and so they were grown for for a full season. Like if it was undersown underneath either buckwheat or millet, that was planted in June, and then the sweet clover wasn't incorporated until the fall the following year, and so you would have about a year and a year and 3 or 4 months or so before where there was no tillage twice in that rotation where there was sweet clover. Any suggestions to add sweet clover to make it a multi-species cover? I have not grown it with other things, just because the sweet clover tends to really dominate. One of the issues with sweet clover that you can run into, and it's the reason why it's not in my family's current rotation, is because we've had issues with the sweet clover weevil. And if you have that in your area and you have issues with that, if you've ever seen that before, you know it makes it almost impossible to grow a good stand of sweet clover. In fact, those weevils, if they're there, they will take out every last sweet clover plant in the area. So we had to go away from sweet clover because of that reason. And it was a big loss in our system to have that taken away from us, for sure. And that's along with the wet springs, that's why we had to go to a shorter rotation with using the sorghum Sudan grass and the cowpea and forage soybean in the soil building year rather. And so I'm not sure about growing it with other species, but you can undersow it underneath some small grains crops to establish it. And that works very well. But once it's growing and it gets up there, it pretty much will outcompete anything else. that's growing with it. So next question, is there anything between the first warm season annual and the second soil building year? You could put something else in between there. You had a winter annual going into a warm season in that first part of the rotation, and then going to the second soil building in the middle of the rotation. You could put another maybe another warm season annual in there. There's going to be some extra tillage involved in doing that, but you're going to be going into a soil building year. So if your weed control was fairly good, say in the soybeans, you could put another warm season crop in there. You know, maybe corn before you go back to the soil building year, or you could do buckwheat like what we had there, that my family does, and maybe have 2 of those in a row. But just be aware again that if you have 2 warm seasons like that, I think you'll be okay as far as weed control going into another soil building year to help with the weeds again. But you might have, if it's corn and soybeans, there you're having 2 years in a row, where again you're making a withdrawal from that soil health bank, and so you may have to lengthen out your rotation in other areas. Like in the second half of the rotation, I would consider lengthening that out with maybe adding a crop like buckwheat in the second half of the rotation if you weren't doing buckwheat before in the first half. So maybe you could do soybeans, corn there before in the first half of the rotation before you get to that middle soil building year, but then maybe you better not do corn in the second half of it. So you're still maybe not gaining any extra in between there than you would have, and spreading them out is probably a better strategy anyway. But it could be done, but are you accomplishing the goal of soil building? Maybe not necessarily. Then you have to make up for that in other ways. All right, let's see, what others do we have here? Okay, here's a question. We're trying to go from 20 years of ag conservation pasture to a small grains rotation. Do you have recommendations for a good crop to start it off? And this is in the northern Maryland area. Okay. So pulling it out of CRP, again, I think I would recommend, starting at the head of the rotation with a crop that is going to be like a soil building year at the head of that rotation. And so taking it out of CRP, putting in, drilling in a controlled crop that's going to be a solid stand of something that you've chosen to be planted there. So it could be like sorghum Sudan grass or something like that. I think that would be maybe ideal to do, just because you're planting that a little bit later in June, the sorghum Sudan grass. You'd have some opportunity to do some tillage and kill some flushes of weeds before you get into planting, and maybe get a fairly stale seed bed going into that sorghum Sudan grass. And sorghum Sudan grass will outcompete and clean up the ground pretty good. And then you can go into, in that fall when it's incorporated, that's I think where I would go in with a cool season, a winter annual, like rye or triticale or winter wheat. But I think set it up with a smother crop in the summer before you go into that, is what I would say. Okay, let's see. Any other questions? All right. I don't see, well, maybe there's another question that popped up here. Okay, so would the optimal crop rotation sequence or species selection be relevant for the Southern Hemisphere, South Africa specifically? Possibly not. There's obviously some differences in climate that are going to happen there. I think that I'm not completely familiar with the climate there in South Africa. But, considering the principle on that rotation and having some winter annual crops, I don't know how much of a winter there is down there. That might be part of the rotation where you don't really have necessarily that option of a winter annual, like we do up in the Northern Hemisphere. I think that would be maybe a little bit different. And so I would have to, connect with you, I think, outside of the webinar here, and I could get some more specifics about what the climate's like there, and probably work on something there with you. So if you wanted some help, get a hold of the consulting, and we can certainly help you with that. That goes for everybody else too. If you've got, again, if you've got questions about your own rotation and trying to diversify it, and where you are in terms of where you'd want to be with plugging into a rotation like that, you need some help figuring that out. Just get a hold of the consulting, and if you're in the Midwest, you'll get matched up with me or my colleague Leah in Wisconsin. But we've got consultants on the East Coast there in Pennsylvania too. There's one down in Georgia, and then we also have someone out in California and New Mexico and New York as well. So we've got a fairly widespread group of consultants that can serve around the United States, but we do also welcome some international questions too. We're always happy to help anybody that comes to us. So yeah, if there aren't any more questions, thanks everyone for attending today, and hope to see you out at one of the Rodale events or field days this summer, and maybe hope to hear from you, and maybe I can help you out on your farm too. So, all right. Thanks everyone. Bye.